Hello everybody, my name is Marian Spain, the Chief Executive of Natural England, and it's a great pleasure to be with you, albeit to be with you virtually, talking about, well, the topic of the moment, how we use nature to tackle climate change, solve our biodiversity problem and improve the quality of everybody's lives. I'm particularly going to be thinking in the next 10 minutes or so about what's the policy context, the domestic and the international policy context, and what that means for people like those of you at today's event who will be actually making the decisions about how we use land, how we develop land, how we plan for land in our countryside and our towns and cities to make the most of those opportunities and to make nature part of the solution. I think it hopefully goes without saying that climate change and biodiversity loss are inextricably linked. And at the moment, they're perhaps linked in a negative spiral where we see that as nature, as natural systems, as ecosystems degrade, the carbon stored within them is lost. And that we also have that impact of climate change itself on our natural ecosystem. So that there's almost a race to the bottom at the moment that we need to break. And we need to break that race, that downward cycle, by restoring our natural ecosystems and our natural habitats so that they absorb carbon from the atmosphere, so they become part of the solution to climate change, as well as supporting and restoring biodiversity, and as well as providing us with all sorts of other benefits that we might call ecosystem services, be it better water quality, lower risk of flood, and improvements to human health, well-being and even educational attainment. So that's what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon, how we actually make that happen. And the reason I want to start with, the reason it's time to be talking about it now, is it's not easy. Getting these solutions right isn't easy, and they take time. They don't all deliver immediately. It can take time to restore an ecosystem, restore nature. But in the same way that over 10 years ago, 2008, I reminded myself just the other day, the Stern Review into the Economics and Climate Change made it absolutely clear that investing in climate change now, every pound spent now is several pounds, tens of pounds saved in the future. And this year, the Dasgupta Review into the Economics of Biodiversity made that same compelling economic argument. Investing money in nature now, starting today, saves money in the future. This is a critical year for nature. There's been some really big announcements already from government and governments around the world. We've seen the UK government sign up to the Leaders' Pledge for Nature and commit to having more of our land, 30% of our land, not just protected but restored by 2030. We've seen announcements just last week by our Secretary of State about a world-leading initiative, a world-leading plan to have a target in the Environment Bill to have our nature not fully restored, but to have bent the curve, to have really begun to see a change in nature recovery by 2030. And at the end of last week, we saw the G7 environment ministers pledge further on nature and climate. And I've just realised, of course, I'm pre-recording this session, so when I refer to last week, I'm talking about mid-May. It'll be more than last week by the time you see this speech. But they're still just as important. And of course, that's even before we've had the two big international conferences this year. In October, we have the International Conference on Biodiversity, where governments across the world commit to binding biodiversity targets. And in November in Glasgow, we have the Climate Change Conference of the Parties, the COP, where we'll be looking for nations around the world to build on the commitments made in Paris in 2015. So be in no doubt that these pledges, this political leadership is real, it's happening now. And the linking word, the linking theme running through all of these events is about nature as the solution. For people like me that have worked in nature conservation for 20, 30 years, this is a real tipping point. I sometimes find myself saying I've spent most of my career arguing to stop nature's losses and working to stop nature's losses through protection, through nature reserves, through designations, through stopping bad things happening to nature. In the last few years, we're now in a place where we see nature as the solution. We're committed to recovering nature. We're committed to restoring. That's a great place to be, but it's also, as I've already said, a challenging place to be for those of us that now have to make that happen and make some of those difficult decisions. We know, though, that it works. Natural England's recently published its own report on how habitats and which habitats have the biggest impact on nature. So we know that peatland is our biggest carbon store. We know that broadleaf woodlands are the second most important thing to invest in. Coniferous woodlands play their part as well, but looking long term, broadleaf woodlands taken over a long-term life cycle are better for carbon. Marine and coastal habitats, salt marshes, seagrasses and so on are important. Rivers and wetlands. And even our habitats, those open habitats we know and love, such as flower-rich meadows and heathlands, they all have an important part to play. So some really important choices for us as we look at rural land use. But we also have some important tools coming forward to help us. 2021 is a significant year when the Environment Bill comes into being, of giving us some tools that we need to think about. It's time to start doing that integrated thinking about nature and land use and carbon and people. It's time to start planning at scale. It's time to start planning with a new range of partners. This is no longer just a job for the conservation sector, it's a job for the farming sector, for the business sector, and it's also an issue for towns as well as the countryside. So it's time to start thinking over days like today's events about how we use the new tools that are coming along. We're going to have legislation coming into force quite quickly that requires biodiversity net gain from all built development. So all housing developers will be not just protecting nature, but putting nature back either on the site or by using that money to offset on projects off-site. A really important role then for local authorities to be thinking about how their land use and their development control policies mesh with biodiversity net gain. Where should we be spending that money? What is the right biodiversity in a place? And one of the important tools that will help us with that are the local nature recovery strategies that will also be mandated in the Environment Bill, that will set out a strategic framework at a local authority scale, probably a county level scale, that shows where we most want nature, where our habitats are already in good condition, where there's opportunities to build them. Manchester, of course, has been one of the pilots for those local nature recovery strategies, and great work being done as we think about how we apply these strategies in an urban environment as well as a rural environment. And again, a real ambition for government that those local nature recovery strategies sit side by side with local plans and help planners and help decision makers think about, if there is going to be development, how does it contribute to nature, to nature-based solutions. And we're seeing real examples happening across the country. At the other end of the country from here in the Solent, we've started to really make progress now on thinking about where water quality, where breaches to water quality standards, both environmental and human health standards, are holding up development. And we're starting to now think the way to tackle that is to have nature-based solutions to suck up that water pollution. So reed beds, wetlands, alongside housing development, so that pollution that's coming from farmland, that's coming from roads, that's coming from sewage overflows and outflows, doesn't become a blocker to development, but development becomes part of the solution to nature. Here in Greater Manchester, of course, I've already mentioned the local nature recovery strategy pilots. There's been an urban pioneer pilot in this area for some years that really helped us think about nature in an urban environment. And flowing from that, we're now seeing a peat pilot, a nature recovery strategy pilot, a green social prescribing pilot, and a biodiversity net gain pilot. So well done, Manchester, lots happening, and an area that I increasingly often see being held up as an exemplar of how these things can all come together. So the peat pilot alone is estimating that 56.7 million I can't read this without my glasses on, cubic metres of peat restored will save 5.02 million tonnes of carbon, which is the equivalent from the emissions of over 1 million homes, almost the entire housing stock of Greater Manchester. So this stuff works, we can quantify it, we can evidence it. And it doesn't all have to be complicated. The local nature recovery strategy pilot here has shown us that it can be as simple as planting street trees, reducing mowing on road verges, creating green roofs, green bridges, and so on. So the final thing I want to just mention is the people side of all of this. We've talked about carbon, we've talked about nature. Let's not also underestimate the benefits of restoring nature to people and of being part of the levelling up agenda. We saw during the COVID pandemic how important local nature was, but also how it is our poorest communities, our most socially distanced communities, our BAME communities that are least likely to have that daily access to nature that is now proven to be good for our health, our mental and physical well-being, and also good for educational attainment if school children can have that daily contact with nature. So a significant difference to life choices. So that's my challenge then to those of you on today's conference. How do we make this happen in a way that is not just a series of projects, but it is a serious long-term look at a strategic plan to restore nature, to tackle climate change, restore wildlife, and improve the quality of lives of people across Greater Manchester and across the UK. I'm really looking forward to be part of the debate later today.